Grace Holloway walked into the courtroom with a calm and steady pace, her heels clicking on the cold floor of the courthouse. As she glanced around at the packed room, she had been in this space before, but never under these circumstances. Today was different. Today she was here not as an observer, but as the defendant, standing before Judge Samuel Hayes, the town's most respected judge, known for his stern rulings and unyielding adherence to the law. Grace wasn't someone who often found herself in trouble. But here she had received a fine for a minor issue related to one of her rental properties, an old duplex that had some maintenance problems that were reported by a tenant. Grace knew the building needed work, but the fine seemed harsh to her. She had already made plans to address the repairs and believed the situation could have been resolved with a simple conversation or a warning, the kind of warning Grace had seen other landlords get with a handshake or a few polite words from a city official. Grace had built a solid reputation as a businesswoman in the community, having bought and restored multiple properties around town, but being a black woman in a predominantly white town meant she sometimes had to prove herself more than others. Grace knew this as a fact. She had fought hard to get where she was, and while she was used to the occasional sideways glance or thinly veiled remark, she never let it affect her business decisions. It was the quiet battles that weighed on her, the ones people didn't talk about, but were always present. Those were the moments that tested her resolve, and today was one of those moments. Today, it felt like the deck was stacked against her. Standing in the courtroom, she noticed Judge Hayes sitting at the bench, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. As he glanced through the papers in front of him, his eyes briefly meeting hers, she straightened her back and stood tall, her presence steady despite the unease that threatened to bubble up. Judge Hayes was an imposing figure known for his no-nonsense approach to the law and for handing down quick judgments with little room for debate. Grace had always respected the law, but today it felt like the scales weren't balanced in her favor. He called the case, and the room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to her. She took a deep breath as she stepped forward to present her case. She tried to maintain a sense of professionalism, even as she could feel the weight of his gaze bearing down on her. Grace calmly explained the situation, the repairs that had been scheduled, the tenant complaints, the efforts she was already making to fix the building. Judge Hayes listened attentively, but there was a coldness in his eyes that Grace couldn't ignore. When she finished speaking, he was quick to speak up. He didn't give her a chance to elaborate or present any further evidence. Instead, he made a quick decision, dismissing her explanations as insufficient and issuing the fine without hesitation. Grace felt a rush of frustration, but she kept her composure. The fine was steep, and she knew it would take time to resolve it, but it wasn't the money that bothered her as much as the unfairness of the ruling. As she left the courtroom, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that the judgment had been harsher than it needed to be, and that something about the entire exchange had been too swift, almost as if she hadn't even been seen as an equal in that space. With Judge Hayes sitting at the bench, detached and distant from the realities of her situation, Grace walked out of the courtroom feeling the sting of injustice linger in the air. Grace spent the next few days stewing over the fine. It wasn't just about the money or the judgment. It was the way Judge Hayes had dismissed her without a second thought. She couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play, a kind of invisible barrier that separated her from him, one that was built not on law, but on bias. She had faced these subtle injustices before, but this time it stung more. She wasn't sure why she felt so unsettled, but as the days passed, the feeling grew heavier. There was something about the judge's behavior that felt personal, as if his decision was influenced by more than just the facts in front of him. Grace had built a reputation over the years as a no-nonsense property owner. She had turned around rundown buildings, revitalized neighborhoods, and made a name for herself in the real estate community. Yet, as a black woman in a predominantly white town, her accomplishments were often overshadowed by the quiet skepticism and occasional subtle racism that came her way. It was something she had learned to navigate, brushing off the slight remarks and sideways glances from people who believed they knew more about her than she did. But this was different. This was a legal decision, one made by a man who held the power to affect her business and her livelihood. After the court session, Grace decided to review the property records for the duplex in question. It had always been one of her more stable properties, a modest two-story building in the older part of town, and she had been in the process of addressing the maintenance issues. Her tenants were good people, and she'd always made sure their needs were met. But there was something about the name Samuel Hayes that caught her eye as she flipped through the tenant files. The judge, her adversary in court, was listed as one of her tenants. She stopped mid-scroll, her fingers hovering over the page. It took a moment for the realization to hit her. Judge Hayes, the man who had just fined her so harshly, was renting an apartment in one of her properties. Grace wasn't sure why it surprised her. It wasn't uncommon for landlords to have tenants they didn't know personally. But the fact that he was her tenant, and that he was now the one who had made the decision to fine her, felt like an ironic twist of fate. She knew of his reputation in the town. He was a fixture in the local legal scene, often considered a man of integrity, fair in his judgments, respected by all. She had heard his name mentioned many times in the context of rulings that seemed impartial and just, at least on the surface. But now, knowing he was living in one of her buildings, the connection felt different. It wasn't just a simple legal matter anymore. It felt like a personal affront, a man who stood in judgment of her, but had no idea who she was beyond the role of a landlord. Worse still, he didn't know he was judging his own landlord. Grace couldn't help but feel a twinge of discomfort. She had never once crossed paths with Judge Hayes in person at the property. He had always been a quiet tenant, paying rent on time, never causing trouble. But now she wondered if that very anonymity was what had allowed him to treat her with such disdain in court. Was it possible that the power he wielded as a judge had affected how he saw her as a person? A woman with authority, yes, but one who would always be other in his eyes. With that thought hanging heavy in her mind, Grace made a decision. She would confront him. Not immediately, but soon. She had to know the truth. Was this judgment a fluke, a simple misunderstanding, or was there something more insidious at play? Either way, she wouldn't sit idly by and let it slide. She was done being passive. The next morning, Grace ran errands as usual, but the weight of the discovery kept gnawing at her. By the time the afternoon sun began to dip low in the sky, she knew what she had to do. She would find a way to speak with Judge Hayes face to face. Something told her that the conversation would not only clarify the fine, but reveal more than either of them might expect. She wasn't sure what would come of it, but Grace felt that the quiet tension between her and the judge was about to unravel. Grace woke early the next morning with a determination she hadn't felt in weeks. The unease from the court hearing still lingered, and she couldn't shake the nagging thought that something deeper was at play. The knowledge that Judge Hayes was her tenant weighed heavily on her mind. She had always believed in fairness, in the idea that law should be impartial and just, but now the very system she had trusted seemed to have failed her. After a quick breakfast, Grace set off to her office, but the thought of confronting Judge Hayes loomed over her like a shadow. She had no idea how he would react if she confronted him about the fine. She had never been the type to seek out conflict, but this was different. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about respect, about fairness, and about something that was far more personal than a legal ruling. That afternoon, after taking care of some paperwork, Grace decided to dig deeper into the details of Judge Hayes' history. She was determined to understand the man who had ruled against her so decisively. As she sifted through the public records, something strange began to emerge. She had always known Judge Hayes had a certain reputation in the town, respected, authoritative, and, to many, a man who was above reproach. His judgments had always seemed fair on the surface. Yet, as Grace pored over case files and decisions he'd handed down in the past, a pattern started to form. There was something about his rulings in landlord-tenant disputes that struck her as odd. It wasn't just the fine she had received, it was how he had handled similar cases in the past. In every case involving black tenants or minority landlords, his decisions seemed harsh, as if he was treating their complaints with less empathy than those of white tenants or property owners. Grace could hardly believe what she was seeing. The records didn't outright prove bias, but the decisions were telling. There was an underlying tone, a consistency in his rulings that suggested something more than impartiality at work. She bookmarked a few cases that raised red flags and moved on to his personal history. There, the pieces fell into place even more clearly. Grace had known of his family. The Hayases had lived in the town for generations. They were old money, well established in both the legal world and the community. Their name carried weight, and people in town often deferred to them out of respect or fear. What struck Grace as she read through the records was not just his professional life, but the more subtle hints of privilege. He had never known hardship in the way she had. His path had been clear, laid out before him by family connections and wealth, while Grace had fought for every inch she'd gained. But the real revelation came when she found a photo in a local history article about the town's early settlers. There, amidst the sepia-toned faces of the founding families, was a young Samuel Hayes, standing proudly beside his father. The picture was taken in front of a large, imposing house, the very house that now belonged to one of Grace's other tenants. Grace had visited the property just the week before for an unrelated repair issue, and it had struck her as one of the wealthier homes in the area. It was a startling realization. Judge Hayes, despite his claims of impartiality, had deep roots in the town's historical power structure. He was a part of the very fabric of privilege that Grace had always felt on the outside of, and it dawned on her. Perhaps the real issue wasn't just about being fined for a small infraction. Perhaps this had all been about something far more entrenched, a system that placed him at the top and people like her at the bottom, even when she was his equal in every sense except in the eyes of the law. Grace closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. The more she uncovered, the more convinced she became. She couldn't let this slide. The town needed to see who Judge Hayes truly was, the man behind the gavel. She would have to confront him, not just as a tenant and a landlord, but as two people navigating the same system in entirely different ways. Her heart raced as she thought of the conversation that lay ahead. She wasn't sure what would happen, but she knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The decision to confront Judge Hayes wasn't one Grace had made lightly. She had thought long and hard about it, weighing the consequences of bringing her findings to light. It was one thing to privately question a man's integrity, but to openly challenge someone in such a powerful position would require more than just facts. It would require courage, and Grace wasn't sure if she was ready for the fallout. Still, the knowledge that something wasn't right gnawed at her. She couldn't ignore it. A week passed before Grace found herself walking down the familiar street that led to the old coffee shop where she often went to clear her mind. It was a quiet spot in town, far enough from the courthouse and the hustle of daily life to offer some peace. As she approached the entrance, her thoughts raced. Would Judge Hayes be there? Would he recognize her as the woman who had stood before him in his courtroom just days earlier? When she stepped inside, she spotted him immediately. He was seated at the far corner, a cup of coffee in front of him, scanning through papers. The moment Grace entered, he looked up, meeting her eyes briefly before quickly glancing down again. There was an awkwardness to the exchange, an unspoken tension that lingered in the air. Grace hesitated for only a moment before walking over to his table. "Judge Hayes," she said, her voice steady but firm. He looked up, clearly surprised to see her, but his expression quickly softened into a polite smile. "Ms. Holloway," he replied, his voice courteous but guarded. "What can I do for you?" Grace paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I just wanted to talk for a minute." The judge's eyebrows furrowed slightly, but he motioned for her to sit down. "Of course, have a seat. What's on your mind?" Grace sat down across from him, the tension between them palpable. She could feel the weight of their shared history. He, the judge who had fined her without hesitation, and she, the landlord whose property he called home, a detail he still hadn't acknowledged. For a moment, Grace simply looked at him. She had spent days reviewing his past decisions, piecing together his history, and now, here he was in front of her, an almost unknowable figure with so much power. "I wanted to ask you about something," Grace began, her voice calm but unwavering. "The fine you issued for the property, there's something I need to understand. I've been going over the details, and I couldn't help but notice a few things." Judge Hayes' gaze hardened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "Go ahead." Grace took a breath, steadying herself. I know we've never met before, but I think there's something we should discuss. You see, it turns out that I'm not just some random landlord. I actually own one of your rental properties. The duplex you're living in, well, it's mine. And I couldn't help but wonder, did you know that when you made that ruling against me? The moment the words left her mouth, there was a visible shift in Hayes' demeanor. His face stiffened, and his fingers tightened around the coffee cup in front of him. Grace watched carefully, reading his reaction. He was caught off guard. There was no mistaking that. But did he feel ashamed, guilty, or simply surprised? He cleared his throat, eyes briefly darting away. I wasn't aware, he said, his tone carefully neutral. I've never made it a point to involve myself in the personal details of my tenants. I don't see the need for it. Grace could tell he was trying to play it off as if it was nothing, but she wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting his with quiet intensity. You're a judge, she said softly. You make decisions that affect people's lives, including mine. And yet, you're also my tenant. Isn't it strange that we've never discussed it? That you've never thought to acknowledge our relationship, however incidental it may seem? There was a long pause. For a moment, Grace wasn't sure if he would respond, but then Hayes looked up at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He sighed, setting his coffee cup down. You're right, he admitted. It is strange, and I've certainly never meant to offend you. I simply didn't make the connection. He paused, and there was a shift in his tone. Look, Miss Holloway, I've never intended to make things difficult for you, but I stand by my rulings. The law is the law. Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She had known this was coming, his refusal to back down. He wasn't going to admit fault so easily, but she wasn't done. Judge Hayes, she said, her voice calm but firm, it's not just about the law. It's about fairness. And I have to ask myself, if you knew who I was when you made that ruling, would you have treated me differently? Would you have been so quick to issue that fine? For a long moment, the judge remained silent. The weight of her words hung in the air between them, and Grace felt a small sense of victory. She had gotten through to him, at least a little. He looked away, his eyes narrowing in thought. I don't know, he finally said. Maybe I would have. Maybe I wouldn't have. Grace leaned back in her chair, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and unease. She wasn't sure what had just happened, whether the conversation had truly changed anything, or if it had just opened the door to more questions. But one thing was certain, she had made her point, and Judge Hayes knew that things would never be the same between them again. As Grace stood up to leave, she looked at the judge one last time. I'm not asking for special treatment, but I do expect to be treated fairly, just like everyone else. With that, she turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving behind the man who had once held power over her life. This part of the story intensifies the conflict as Grace directly challenges Judge Hayes, setting the stage for further revelations and emotional confrontations. It builds on the tension while giving the reader insight into both characters' motivations. Grace couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with Judge Hayes. As she sat in her small office later that evening, sorting through papers and tenant complaints, her mind kept returning to the judge's face when she confronted him. His initial surprise, the way he had tried to brush her off with his neutral legalese, and the underlying tension that had thickened the air between them, it all felt wrong. He had admitted there was a connection between them, but the words felt empty, like he was merely going through the motions. Grace had always been good at reading people, and she trusted her instincts. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't even close to understanding what he had done. She could feel that much. What bothered her most was that the fine hadn't just been about a technicality. It had been about power, control, and perhaps something more personal. That night after she left the coffee shop, Grace went home and decided she couldn't stop at just questioning him. She had to understand what kind of man Judge Hayes truly was. She needed to know if there was more to his actions than simple oversight. There was something deeper at play here, and she wasn't going to let it slide. The next few days were a blur of research. Grace dug into old court records, searching for patterns in Hayes' rulings, especially in landlord-tenant disputes. What she found made her stomach twist. The inconsistencies were glaring. Decisions that seemed to favor wealthier, predominantly white property owners over tenants of color. In case after case, she saw a troubling pattern. When minority landlords or tenants were involved, the rulings were harsher. Evictions were expedited, fines were higher, and settlements were more favorable to landlords who had the means to appeal. It wasn't just the fine against her, it was his entire history. The evidence was mounting, and Grace could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. But what troubled her most was the subtle nature of the bias. It wasn't overt or explicit. It was the kind of bias that was woven into the very fabric of the system, one that was easy to overlook if you didn't know what to look for. Grace's heart raced as she went through case after case. The more she uncovered, the more she felt the pieces falling into place. It wasn't just about power, it was about privilege and how that privilege had shaped Judge Hayes' decisions over the years. She wasn't sure if he even realized the depth of his bias. It seemed to be second nature for him, a blind spot so ingrained in his worldview that he didn't even think to question it. But Grace had seen it clearly, and that clarity was what drove her forward. She wasn't going to let the system bury the truth. She would take action. She wasn't just going to fight this fine. She was going to bring this issue to light, expose the flaws in Hayes' rulings, and make sure the town saw him for what he truly was. Her first step was clear. She needed help. She reached out to Henry Owens a local lawyer with a reputation for fighting for the underdog. He had helped Grace on a few smaller matters in the past, but this was different. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about dismantling a system of injustice that had been quietly entrenched for decades. Henry was quick to agree to take the case, though he wasn't sure where it would lead. He had seen the cracks in the system too, but he knew that challenging a judge with as much power and influence as Hayes would be no easy feat. "We'll need more than just your case," Henry told her. "We'll need solid evidence, something that shows this bias goes beyond just one ruling." Grace nodded. "I have that evidence," she said, "and I'm willing to stand up for it." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal work and strategy. Grace and Henry met regularly, going through old court transcripts, talking to tenants who had been affected by Hayes' rulings, and gathering testimonies. Each piece of evidence they uncovered was a small victory, but also a stark reminder of the deep-rooted prejudice that had shaped Judge Hayes' decisions. Grace felt the weight of it all as she prepared to face Hayes again, but this time it wouldn't be just a casual conversation. It would be a battle for justice. As the day of the next hearing approached, Grace's resolve only grew stronger. She knew what she was up against, a powerful, respected judge who had the entire legal system backing him. But she also knew that she couldn't let fear hold her back. The truth had a way of coming to light, no matter how much people tried to bury it. And Grace Holloway was ready to make sure the truth would shine through. Grace couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with Judge Hayes. As she sat in her small office later that evening, sorting through papers and tenant complaints, her mind kept returning to the judge's face when she confronted him. His initial surprise, the way he had tried to brush her off with his neutral legalese, and the underlying tension that had thickened the air between them. It all felt wrong. He had admitted there was a connection between them, but the words felt empty, like he was merely going through the motions. Grace had always been good at reading people, and she trusted her instincts. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't even close to understanding what he had done. She could feel that much. What bothered her most was that the fine hadn't just been about a technicality. It had been about power, control, and perhaps something more personal. That night, after she left the coffee shop, Grace went home and decided she couldn't stop at just questioning him. She had to understand what kind of man Judge Hayes truly was. She needed to know if there was more to his actions than simple oversight. There was something deeper at play here, and she wasn't going to let it slide. The next few days were a blur of research. Grace dug into old court records, searching for patterns in Hayes' rulings, especially in landlord-tenant disputes. What she found made her stomach twist. The inconsistencies were glaring. Decisions that seemed to favor wealthier, predominantly white property owners over tenants of color. In case after case, she saw a troubling pattern. When minority landlords or tenants were involved, the rulings were harsher. Evictions were expedited, fines were higher, and settlements were more favorable to landlords who had the means to appeal. It wasn't just the fine against her, It was his entire history. The evidence was mounting, and Grace could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. But what troubled her most was the subtle nature of the bias. It wasn't overt or explicit. It was the kind of bias that was woven into the very fabric of the system, one that was easy to overlook if you didn't know what to look for. Grace's heart raced as she went through case after case. The more she uncovered, the more she felt the pieces falling into place. It wasn't just about power. It was about privilege and how that privilege had shaped Judge Hayes' decisions over the years. She wasn't sure if he even realized the depth of his bias. It seemed to be second nature for him, a blind spot so ingrained in his worldview that he didn't even think to question it. But Grace had seen it clearly, and that clarity was what drove her forward. She wasn't going to let the system bury the truth. She would take action. She wasn't just going to fight this fine. She was going to bring this issue to light, expose the flaws in Hayes' rulings, and make sure the town saw him for what he truly was. Her first step was clear. She needed help. She reached out to Henry Owens a local lawyer with a reputation for fighting for the underdog. He had helped Grace on a few smaller matters in the past, but this was different. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about dismantling a system of injustice that had been quietly entrenched for decades. Henry was quick to agree to take the case, though he wasn't sure where it would lead. He had seen the cracks in the system too, but he knew that challenging a judge with as much power and influence as Hayes would be no easy feat. "We'll need more than just your case," Henry told her. "We'll need solid evidence, something that shows this bias goes beyond just one ruling." Grace nodded. "I have that evidence," she said, "and I'm willing to stand up for it." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal work and strategy. Grace and Henry met regularly, going through old court transcripts, talking to tenants who had been affected by Hayes' rulings, and gathering testimonies. Each piece of evidence they uncovered was a small victory, but also a stark reminder of the deep-rooted prejudice that had shaped Judge Hayes' decisions. Grace felt the weight of it all as she prepared to face Hayes again, but this time it wouldn't be just a casual conversation. It would be a battle for justice. As the day of the next hearing approached, Grace's resolve only grew stronger. She knew what she was up against, a powerful, respected judge who had the entire legal system backing him. But she also knew that she couldn't let fear hold her back. The truth had a way of coming to light, no matter how much people tried to bury it. And Grace Holloway was ready to make sure the truth would shine through. The days following the courtroom hearing were a blur for Grace. She barely slept, her mind replaying every word spoken in that room, every moment of tension between her and Judge Hayes. She had known the fight wouldn't be easy, but something about the way he had faltered, just for a second, in that courtroom made her believe there was a chance that the truth might win out. But the aftermath wasn't as swift or as clear-cut as she hoped. In the week that followed, the local media picked up on the case. The small-town courthouse was used to the occasional story of local disputes, but the confrontation between Grace and Judge Hayes felt different. A black woman, a business owner, challenging a respected white judge. That was a story. It was the kind of story that tugged at the long-buried tensions of the town, the kind of story people would whisper about over coffee or in church pews. Grace's phone rang constantly, though the calls weren't all supportive. Some were from curious neighbors, others from people who had always been quick to call her a troublemaker or too ambitious for a woman like her. There were murmurs of discontent from those who had always admired Judge Hayes, who couldn't fathom that someone like him could be capable of prejudice. They rallied behind him, dismissing the evidence as circumstantial or unimportant. It was clear that the roots of bias ran deep, both in the system and within the community. Grace wasn't surprised by the pushback. It was exactly what she had expected. People didn't want to confront uncomfortable truths, especially when they had been complicit in letting things slide for so long. But there were others who reached out with words of encouragement. Tenants who had once been afraid to speak up now found their voices, offering their support and sharing their own stories of unfair treatment at the hands of the legal system. Grace's bravery had sparked something in them, a feeling that they, too, might have a chance at justice. Even Henry, who had been with her every step of the way, seemed more optimistic. He had seen these kinds of cases before, cases where the odds were stacked against a victim of systemic bias. He knew that while the legal battle was far from over, the mere act of exposing the truth had already shifted something in the town. Yet, despite all the noise and attention, the question still loomed. Would Judge Hayes be held accountable? Would his decades of rulings be enough to force the hand of the judicial system? Grace knew that the real fight was just beginning. A week later, they received the judge's ruling. Grace sat in Henry's office, staring at the paper in her hands. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she scanned the words, each line a weight, each sentence a small victory or a bitter disappointment. The ruling was mixed. Judge Hayes acknowledged the evidence presented by Grace and her team. He admitted that certain aspects of his rulings had not been as impartial as they should have been, especially in cases involving minority landlords and tenants. However, he stopped short of admitting outright bias. Instead, he offered a vague apology, citing his commitment to ensuring fair and equal treatment moving forward. There was no mention of discipline or repercussions for his previous actions. There was no removal from the bench or any other meaningful consequence. It wasn't the victory Grace had hoped for, but it was still a step forward. The acknowledgement of bias, while not a full confession, was an important first step. It forced people to confront the uncomfortable reality that the system was flawed and that even judges weren't above reproach. The media coverage of the ruling was predictably mixed. Some hailed it as a small but necessary change, a step toward accountability. Others dismissed it as a political move, a way for Hayes to save face without facing the consequences of his actions. Grace, however, knew that the ruling was just the beginning. There was still work to be done. The following months brought a series of hearings, public discussions, and reviews of other court decisions involving Judge Hayes. The public discourse, sparked by Grace's case, continued to gather momentum. More stories of unfair treatment came to light, and more people began to speak up. People who had been afraid to rock the boat, who had lived in fear of losing their homes or businesses because of the judge's power. But now, with the spotlight on the issue, things were starting to shift. For Grace, the victory was bittersweet. She had not won in the way she had imagined, but she had forced a reckoning. She had changed the conversation. She had made people question the fairness of a system they had long assumed was just, and in that, she found her peace. She had done what needed to be done. She had stood up, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been silenced by fear and inequality. As for Judge Hayes, his career was never quite the same. Though he remained on the bench, his reputation had been forever tarnished. People no longer viewed him with the same reverence. His decisions were scrutinized with a level of suspicion that hadn't existed before. And in a small way, that was enough for Grace. The system had been shaken, and it was now up to the people to keep pushing for change. Grace leaned back in her chair, surprised at how quickly Marilyn had come to this realization. It hadn't been easy for her to get to this point, but now there was no turning back. "You're right," Grace said softly. "There's so much more we need to do, and it's going to take more than just one person. It's going to take a movement." The seed had been planted. Grace knew the road ahead would be just as difficult as the one she had walked with Judge Hayes. But this time, she wouldn't be walking alone. Marilyn wasn't the only one who had been inspired by Grace's courage. Others had watched her challenge the system and had decided they weren't going to stay silent anymore. Within weeks, Grace and Marilyn had organized a coalition of tenants, landlords, and activists who had all experienced the shortcomings of the local legal system. They began pushing for fairer housing regulations, rent controls, tenant protections, and better transparency in landlord-tenant disputes. They fought for laws that would ensure the system was truly equitable, not just for the privileged few, but for everyone. Their work wasn't easy. There were setbacks, long nights of paperwork, hours spent at city council meetings, and endless phone calls trying to drum up support. But there were victories too, small ones at first, like getting a rent freeze passed for certain neighborhoods, or seeing more tenant advocates at local council meetings. And each victory, no matter how small, felt like a victory for everyone who had ever been overlooked or silenced by a biased system. One crisp winter evening, Grace stood before the city council, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was filled with supporters, some old faces and some new, all of them united in the fight for change. The council members sat at their desks, waiting for her to speak. This isn't just about housing, Grace began, her voice clear and strong. This is about dignity. It's about respect. It's about making sure that everyone, regardless of their skin color, their income, or their background, has access to the same opportunities. We are all deserving of fairness, and that starts with the laws we live by. The room fell silent, every eye on her. Grace knew that this was just one more step, one more moment in the long journey of change. But as she spoke, she realized that the fight had already begun to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just her fight, it was all of theirs. As the council members deliberated, Grace looked out at the crowd. She thought of Judge Hayes, of the fine, of the countless other battles she had fought. She had started with one small act of defiance, but it had rippled outward, bringing others into the fold. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a deep sense of hope. The world wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. But Grace knew that she had taken a stand, and that was the first step toward changing it.